All right, good day, folks. Thanks for coming to Finding Warmth to Our Sun. Welcome back this week. This is a brand new episode. I'm Matthew Brown, your host here, Madison365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and all that jazz. Hope everybody's doing well. About to come up my own 2 weeks with the vaccine. But it's been you can't do anything in this country and without a lot of interesting things happening. So this Tim Scott. All right. America is not racist. Well, I mean, first, America is racist. Now with our Vice President Harris, I understand why she had to make, the comment that she made, even if she believes opposite. I don't know if she believes opposite, but I know we're never going to get, at least right now, a vice president of a empire whose job is to run the empire to say America's a racist country, contrary to all the evidence. So, America is racist. I hate to break it to you. It is a racist, super racist country. Many racists and racisms. But let's talk through this. And let's work our way through this, because this is a real opinion that goes across the political spectrum, particularly among white folks. Now, if you are Black, brown, Asian, you are definitely more likely to believe America is a racist country. Now, not everybody's going to have this perception. How it breaks down is there's going to be a large section of folks that believe America is not racist, but there are racists in the country. Now, this is a misreading of a few different things of what racism is, of the history of this country, and the present. So really kind of what racism is in real ways. So we're gonna work through this. But a lot of this has to do, I think, with the propaganda of America, of what we tell ourselves, and particularly how we talk about racism in the zeitgeist. It's something that's been pushed back against recently, and how we think about racism and kind of in the broader context is really at the individual level. And this is something that was really a reaction to the civil rights movement. And the gains from the civil rights movement is you saw a consensus, particularly among white liberals and conservatives, on how to think about and address racism, particularly in a legal context, where they love to present, law as this kind of race neutral type of thing. Now, there's nothing in America that's race neutral. A good example of this is pushing even just race neutral policies, so-called race neutral policies, particularly whoever the conservative party is going to be, has always perpetuated these race neutral policies as, not race neutral. And let's think about like welfare, right? And some of this has absolutely to do with racism, where welfare is one of these things is wasn't seen bad, particularly by white folks, until it was through propaganda pushed as, Black welfare queens and something Black people benefit from more than white people. And so then it was, made this boogeyman of Black people taking away government resources that are rightfully white Americans. And let's be clear here, government assistance and welfare weren't looked upon as bad until these things were looked upon or looked at as something benefiting Black people or benefiting Black people to a greater extent. And part of that has to do with racism, as far as racial disparities in income and wealth creation, which were created because of racism. This is kind of a 1,000-foot view, and I'm veering off a path as I do. But let's think about this. So America is a racist country. And if you don't believe this, let me ask you, when was it not racist? When did it stop being racist? Where in this country, in its institutions, in everywhere, do widespread racial disparities not exist? Where was the break that's like, let's pick the year, let's pick 2 years. When did this country stop being racist? And this is kind of the crux of some of it too, and really some of the 1619 Project and where people get hung up on the founding, that the core founding of this country was racism. They'll point to the high-minded ideals of the Declaration of Independence, all men created equal. Well, what did these folks think? Who was considered the Americans? Who were considered men? Not beyond like the gendered concept, right? And you see it in their writings, and we're seeing a resurgence of this, but the idea of like Anglo-Saxon, right, was something we saw some of the founding fathers write about as far as who was considered equal. And in the Constitution, it was land-owning white men. Those were the people only that were supposedly deserving of this equality. It's seen in their writing. It's absolutely seen in their writing on who they thought was deserving of that statement. It's indisputable. We also see it within some of the actions. But there's also folks that will argue, well, we can't judge these people by the morals of our time, which is a very ignorant and racist statement on its own. Because one, it erases the agency and humanity of all the enslaved Black people that knew that what's happening to them was wrong. They knew it was wrong. You know, you might have been able to find one or two that were shucking and jiving along, and we'll actually get to that too in a second, on how oppressors have always found one or two, particularly Black folks that agree with them, that they put front and center to justify their racism and say, see, we're not racist. And we'll get to that. But you found this, you know, in the Founding Fathers' writing, you know, these slave owners. A lot of them actually wrote, and, you know, I should say those that said we can't judge the morals by their time will also then turn and say that these same white men wrote how they knew slavery was wrong. That begs the question, if we can't judge them on the morals of our time, and they also knew it was wrong, do we not like see how these things like don't really fit together as an argument? And then you add on top of it, even if they knew it was wrong, these folks, one, in their writings, still saw Black folks as inferior. A lot of them argued that slavery was for, you know, to our own good, to show us what, you know, hard work is and what civilization is, and to the benefit of of America. They also kept the institution going. So these were very, you know, immoral men, evil men. That also, in being colonists, not immigrants, colonists, because there's a taking over of a country, of land, and displacement of people. This was a genocide of our indigenous nations here. Exterminated them. So when did this country stop being racist? If slavery of Black people was a core part of this nation, and these men didn't see these other humans as deserving of freedom under the law, or even at times, you know, we saw this in what was it, the Dred Scott decision and other Supreme Court cases, that Black Americans weren't seen as deserving of freedom, or as Americans, and were kind of legally written as subhuman in ways. So when did America not, you know, stop becoming racist? Was this during the Civil War, when the Confederacy seceded, or the states that loosely correlated to the Confederacy seceded from the United States and rebelled against the United States, explicitly to preserve the institution of slavery and explicitly to create a slave state? You know, the Constitution of the Confederacy was written in such a way that you can never outlaw slavery. It was the creation of a slave state. Was it with Lincoln, who also believed Black people to be inferior and waffled and waved on emancipation, and had to be convinced by folks like Booker T. Washington to move on it? Was it during Reconstruction that was abandoned and overthrown due to basically the guerrilla warfare and violent coups and lynchings and uprisings across the South that the United States government, run by white men, didn't have the guts to see through? That they felt that it was in more the best interest to forgive those that rebelled against the United States and bring them back into the Union, ending Reconstruction, ushering in the era of Jim Crow, which was just as violent, but institutionalized an apartheid state throughout the country. Where in the North you still had, de jure or de facto, I'm forgetting the definition, but whatever, racism and segregation, where the history of policing and police institutions in this country were explicitly created around slave catching, and this was federalized stuff, and a lot of these, very early police formations across the nation, not just in the South, were formed to catch and bring slaves back. It wasn't just in the South. Slave catching was a national project, absolutely a national project. So when did it end? So if it wasn't the 1800s, going into the 1900s, where lynchings were just as rampant, racist police across the country, states and sundown towns across the country. In Wisconsin, Madison is surrounded by sundown towns, meaning that if you're black, you better get out of town, risk arrest or death. Thousands of black people disappeared across the country, unable to find good working jobs. You had black codes and vagrancy laws put in place that arrested black people for just existing and then putting them back into plantations all across the nation to work. The rise of prison labor, black prison labor. So when did it end? When did it end? Segregation across the country, segregated armed forces, men lynched in their uniforms coming back from World War I and World War II. Continuation of Jim Crow. When did it end? So you had the Civil Rights Movement. Was it then? When the Supreme Court and the federal government had to enforce, these laws, like the Civil Rights Act, were acts to enforce the Constitution, right? Like the 14th Amendment. To enforce the Constitution around voting rights access. And the idea of separate but equal. But even then, that's a twist, because when we think about so segregation was gotten rid of, or legal segregation. And there's integration. Black teachers were fired as black schools were torn down and black kids busted into white neighborhoods. That doesn't seem very right. Not racist. Was it the killings of all these civil rights leaders by white folks? And then was it 1968 after the death of King, when you had the FBI continuing COINTELPRO and violently assassinating, to be redundant, but assassinating Black Panthers and sending them up on bogus charges. Chicago Police Department assassinating Fred Hampton and other leaders across the country. Was it then? When we built the highway system through black neighborhoods across the country, displacing hundreds of thousands of black people and destroying thousands of black businesses and black wealth and home ownership and land ownership, to build the highways that supported white suburbs? Was it that? Was it building federalized housing with minimal resources, built like prisons, like Cabrini Greens? Because federal housing can work if it's done right, but you have to treat people like humans, like they're worthy of it, and put in supplies and resources. So was it then? And then was it when we put as much effort into, didn't put as much effort into ending poverty in this country? She did into exporting war and invading countries in the Vietnam War and sending mostly, black and brown people on the front line to die in mass? So then, was it treating crack and heroin like a criminal problem instead of a healthcare problem? Criminalizing black folks instead of treating them as human? Was it then? Did segregationists lose their positions as elected officials as they're breaking our Constitution? Did racist bankers who are practicing redlining and discriminatory lending practices lose their jobs? Or other businesses that just weren't hiring black people, saw them as unqualified, lose their jobs? When was this? So the 80s, when Madison had to, face civil rights lawsuits for forced busing. Was it then? Was it in the 80s when the Philadelphia Police Department dropped a bomb on the Move compound, killing kids, and their ashes were sitting in anthropology departments in Penn State and Stanford to be studied, as their parents didn't really know what happened to them? Was it then? And this just was released. Was it during all the medical experimentation and forced sterilization that we thought ended in the 70s, 1970s, which isn't that long ago? I was born in 85. And we just found out California is still doing forced sterilizations in their prisons. Was it then? Was it the drug war? Militarizing police forces to act as occupying forces in our black neighborhoods that weren't invested in? Was it then? Was it after Rodney King when he said, why can't we all just get along? Was it then? When was this? What institutions don't we see massive disparities in across income levels, from health disparities, right? Beyond just access to healthcare, but you're talking about maternal mortality rates, infant mortality rates. How there's a large percentage of doctors that believe black people are more tolerant to pain and have thicker skin. Or education disparities and resources. Income levels, regardless of educational attainment, that stretch across educational attainment, wealth, access, housing access. We know there's still discriminatory housing lending practices and realtor practices where valuing black homes lesser than white homes. We know this. This is well documented. Or hiring practices of somebody with the same resume has a black sounding name is less likely to get hired as somebody with a white sounding name, or how a white man with a high school diploma and a criminal offense and criminal record is more likely to land a job than a black male with a college diploma. Where you can send a white man in with the exact same record and resume as a black man, more likely to get hired. Or sentencing disparities where black and white with exact same or similar criminal backgrounds, black people face far higher sentencing disparities. Or the disparities of killing black folks by law enforcement. Talking about environmental factors, environmental racism, how black folks are more likely to experience asthma and other health effects because of exposure to dangerous chemicals in the land. St. Louis, there's a black neighborhood built on top of a nuclear waste site. Or how we still continue basically the clause of the 3/5 clause when it comes to our prison system. We lock up mostly black and brown folks, ship them to prisons in rural areas, rural communities, where they're watched by white overseers. And we make it so that their address that is that prison, and they're then counted in the census for that district. But they don't get a vote. They can't vote. They don't have representation. But those white folks get more representation because of those black prisoners. And then as they're removed from their neighborhoods, their communities, they lose representation. Shifted to white neighborhoods, white communities. Is that not racist? So really, there's only two possible answers here. One is that America is a deeply racist nation that practices racism and continues to practice racism at every level, institutional, systemic, systematic, and individual. Or America isn't a racist country and these disparities are the fault of black people, which is a racist mentality, racist mindset. And really, there's no evidence to support this. I mean, we know black fathers are more involved in their children's lives than white fathers. That was a CDC study. We know black families more invested in their children's education and obtaining a college degree more than actually white families. Multiple studies on this. So the myth of the broken black family because they might not be married, right? The nuclear family is overrated in of itself. The myth of not valuing education. I mean, these things and all these myths and stereotypes have been broken over and over and perpetually over again. So those that behemoth against critical race theory and the teaching that racism was a foundational aspect of this country and in its law and practice of law. So what is it? So let me ask some question. An author, Steve Barnes, I saw asked once. He said, if roles were reversed, if all history and present of this nation were reversed, of black and white Americans, do you believe white Americans would be in the same socio-political position and condition as black Americans? Or do you not? It's a yes or no. So if you believe that they would, then you recognize that racism exists and this is a deeply racist country because you recognize those conditions. If you believe that it's separate, then somehow you believe there's something special or different about white folks, something different about race that makes white folks special, that they wouldn't be in these same, social, political, and economic conditions as black Americans, which is one of the core definitions of racism, of being racist. Another question, if you don't think racism exists, would you be black by choice if you were white? And I'm not talking about LeBron James, right? Where you can be a peak human and access to resources, but just some regular everyday person that's black, working a job, hoping to raise a family, buy a house, have some kids. Would you be black? Honestly. Back to Tim Scott. He's how white folks launder racism or their racism. They find one black person or a few black people that agree with their position, that openly agree with them, and then push them out front or push their argument out front as a way to say, see, if I was racist, this black person wouldn't be saying this. You use all the time. And this is done across the political spectrum. And sometimes they even actually pick black people that wouldn't agree with them, like Dr. King. While they cherry pick quotes outside of the larger context of a speech, or don't actually even understand what he's talking about and say, see, he said this. And they, love to harp on, I have a James speech out of context with stuff to say it talks about colorblindness. It's colloquial misreadings. It happens across the political spectrum. But mostly white people do it across the political spectrum. Cloak their racism with the black person that agrees with them. Find the few that do. While ignoring all the meticulous data and mountains of research and history, documented history of these things. Sometimes intentionally, other times because of our educational system teaches a propagandized a version of the United States that whitewashes it of its sins and downplays the horrors of enslavement and genocide, of Jim Crow, of its practices. Talks about things that it's like it's happenstance, like it just happened, or that it was a long time ago. Well, my father experienced the tail end of Jim Crow. He's alive. It wasn't that long ago. You can find videos of the 80s of kids harassing black kids, of white kids harassing black kids of families that moved into white neighborhoods. There were race riots, basically, of these things. And then you had white flight. White flight still continues. So what do you explain this behavior with? There's always these cloaks of, well, I don't want my home value decreasing. But why does it decrease when black families move in? Why? We cloak this stuff. We hide from it. We don't tell the truth of this country. And then when we tell the truth, folks across the, particularly white folks across the political spectrum, say, oh, we can't talk about critical race theory, one, without understanding what critical race theory is. And they say, well, you know, one, it'll radicalize white folks. Well, they're already radicalized. This is an empire. The moderate position is a radical position. It's a violent position. They do that. And they say we can't talk about it because then it'll teach American kids to hate America. Well, if teaching the truth about this country makes kids hate it, what does that mean? What does that mean? If that's your argument against CRT, say teaching it will make kids hate America. What does that mean? And in fact, there's actually a strange hope and you know, reaching this stuff. A lot of folks like King used the rhetoric of those high-minded ideals and saying, you owe this promise to us. You know, that somewhere I read, you owe this to us. I mean, and one of his things, he went off on talking about land grants and colleges that taught white folks how to farm while displacing black farmers that weren't afforded this stuff. And a little bit before he assassinated, he said, we're coming to D.C. to get our check, right? Talked about reparations. And a lot of white folks don't like to talk about how King called for reparations and massive redistributions of wealth and definitely wasn't a capitalist and identified far more with socialist practices and economics. We ignore those things because it makes white folks more comfortable in themselves. So no, the only answer, if you are not racist, is that America is racist. And if you are racist, you're just in denial. And if you disagree that America is racist, you're in denial about your own racism or your own views of sorts of the United States. In a lot of sense, you're in denial. Because it's the lens in which you choose. You're living the lie of America. The lie of America. And you have to see the truth. The country is what it is. But then a lot of these folks that again, like King and Booker T and James Baldwin, and many others have fought for something different, haven't abandoned America. In fact, they were invested in the American project and saying we can be more than what we are, that we don't have to stay this way. That is the hope. That's the hope of America, is it not? And if you want to diminish that, then you are actually diminishing the hope of America by saying we can't be better, by saying wait for your freedom. Wait for your freedom. Listen to yourself. Wait for your freedom. Why should other people wait? That is it for this week. Thanks for coming to Find the Warmth of Our Sun. I'm Matthew Broggan, your host here at Masson 365. You can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, and it's nice out. Hope you all enjoy it. Get yourself vaxxed if you're not, and have yourselves a good week. Thanks.
This is 365 Media.